On the 16th of December 2015, 43-year-old Sian Samantha Blake and her two sons, Zachary and Amon, were reported missing in London after her sister and parents did not hear from her after a few days. Sian Blake was particularly vulnerable as she had been diagnosed with a terminal illness just days before she was last seen. 4 years earlier, another woman went missing from London, 29-year-old Gemma McCluskie. Gemma attended the opening of the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel on the 1st of March 2012, went out with friends and then home, never to be seen alive again. These two women are connected by a major factor. They were both former actresses, having worked on the popular British soap opera Eastenders. Hey there little berries and newberries, Berry here. Welcome if you are new, welcome back if you are not. Before exploring the cases of Gemma McCluskie and Sian Blake, I wish to thank the subscribers, my little berries, and the channel members, the newberries. If you want to become a member of Berry True Crime, please click the join button below, the link above, or the link in the description. It costs £2.99 a month and you receive early access to videos and member-only content. If you would like the perks and would like to support me but don't want to join YouTube, I do have a Patreon which receives the same perks as YouTube members. But if you don't wish to do any of these things, just watching helps, as well as clicking the like button if you're so inclined. Leave me a comment, whichever you want to do. And if you think that you might want to come back and see what else I've got or see what I've got coming up in the future, subscribing will sort that out for you. Clicking it and then turning on the bell, it will be on your list. You'll get a notification. You don't have to go searching for anything anymore. It'll be right there for you. The trigger warnings for this case are themes of domestic violence and coercive control in both a marital home and between family members, the murders of 2 women and 2 children, dismemberment, drug abuse, and includes a diagnosis of a degenerative neurological disease. Viewer discretion is advised. There is no disrespect intended to anyone involved in these cases. Information in this video is based on what I have researched online and in the public domain. Corrections are welcome in the comments with sources cited. Sian Samantha Blake, also known as Sian to some people, was born on the 14th of September 1971 in Walthamstow in London. She had 5 brothers and sisters and her parents separated when she was very young, but the family still remained very, very close. From a young age, Sian showed real academic promise and her family wanted her to go to university. They wanted her to achieve really well because she was so intelligent. She did so well at school. But Sian had a passion. She had a real drive to become an actress. That was all she wanted to do. She attended the Guildford School of Acting and turned that into a degree. Her family fully supported her and she enjoyed really good success in theatre and television and some film. Her agent Joanna commented that Sian did a lot of things that people don't really know about. There were so many extra acting credentials that she had under her belt and she was, quote, very well thought of in the industry. Sian was chatty, she was just lovely and bubbly and generally a well-liked person, and her family were everything to her. Sian's father passed away when she was 18, just when she was getting on her way to becoming an actress, but she didn't let this stop her. She made her father proud. She got a degree and she went on and achieved her dreams. After starring in an episode of Casualty, like a lot of actors just starting out in their careers, they often have a day job or something on the side to help support them, because sometimes when you are an actor or an actress, it's difficult to get consistent work and therefore you need to make ends meet. So Sian began working as a receptionist on the side, but she did get her big break in June 1996. Sian auditioned for a role as a nurse in the UK soap opera EastEnders, but she was so good that they said they wanted to offer her a main role, playing a character called Frankie Pierre. Frankie Pierre was first introduced as a soul singer in the club, and she then went on to have an affair with Alan Jackson, who was Carol Jackson's partner. It ultimately ended Carol and Alan's relationship. Frankie was very different to Sian. Sian was a very genuine and kind and lovely person. Frankie was a bit of a soap bitch. She was a homewrecker, had no qualms about being with married men, and was thus an unpopular character within the EastEnders universe, but also with the public. They loved to hate her. Sian played Frankie so well that her initial 6-month contract was extended, and she was so convincing in her role that people actually thought that she was Frankie in real life. Sian received death threats and hate mail from the public. Unfortunately, that does happen when you are known to people. People do send you messages of hate, but this really upset Sian. She did her job so well that she was getting criticized simply for being too good. They didn't realize that Sian was an actress and not Frankie, but the public couldn't separate the two people. Sometimes when you are good at your job, it backfires. You either end up typecast if you're an actor, or people think you're like your character in real life, like it happened to Sian. Although her contract had been extended, the producers obviously were very pleased with her. She did voluntarily leave the soap in March 1997 after starring in over 50 episodes. She still continued to act in film, TV, and theatre, and also did voiceover work in some games and some commercials. In addition to acting, Sian had another passion in her life. She had a relative who was deaf, so she learned how to do sign language, and she would go and do some work in that area. According to her agent, Sian actually took work as a sign interpreter over any acting roles. That was a bit more of a passion for her. Ultimately though, Sian did withdraw more and more from acting and essentially became a retired actress, and she became a sign language interpreter full-time. In the mid-2000s, Sian met model and hairdresser to the stars Arthur Simpson-Kent. Arthur was originally from Ghana but had lived in the UK since he was 8 years old. They fell in love and eventually moved from Walthamstow, where her family lived and still live, to Erith, which is just south of the Thames. Over the next 10 years, they had 2 sons together, Zachary and Amon, born in 2005 and 2011 respectively. Sian was devoted to her boys, putting them first above everything. Her agent said she was a fantastic mum, and these 2 boys were her priority. Despite the Ghanaian-born Arthur Simpson-Kent being a model and hairdresser, he was mostly out of work doing some odd jobs such as painting and decorating. Sian was the one that worked hardest, and she financially supported the family. A lot of the documentaries on this case refer to Sian as being the breadwinner. Sian's family though didn't get on with Arthur. They didn't bond with him, and Sian's sister Ava said that Arthur didn't make the family feel welcome. Yet the family were there for Sian and the children. They were so close that Sian spoke with her mother Pansy almost every single day. She went to their home every week for Sunday lunch together. They were never not in contact, and if they couldn't get hold of Sian, she would always get back to them without fail. Although Sian and Arthur's relationship was initially very loving and very close, after Amon was born, the relationship started to go quite south, and Sian wanted to end the relationship, yet it's very hard to do that, especially when your partner is controlling and abusive, which Arthur was. Before meeting Sian, Arthur met a lady called Dominique in the mid-90s, and they moved to her native France where they married. Dominique reported that although Arthur was very charming and alluring and happy, his personality drastically shifted from this upbeat and charming man. Arthur became depressed, sad, and then beginning to control Dominique, with the police being called several times to their domestic incidents. But Dominique was not one to put up with this. They'd even had a daughter together, and she didn't want her daughter to go through this. So Dominique ended their marriage, and Arthur moved back to the UK. This was in around 2003, and not long after this, he met Sian Blake. As well as problems in their relationship with regard to domestic incidents, Sian had other problems. In September 2013, she noticed some strange neurological symptoms and became very weak, unable to carry out certain tasks such as driving or taking care of herself. Sian wanted to continue to see her family every week as she did. She would drive from Erith to Walthamstow, but she was so weak that Arthur had to drive her. Yet he did this begrudgingly, and Sian's illness, whatever it was they didn't know at the time, meant that he could have more control over her because he could say how often she saw her family. So he agreed to once every 2 weeks, but he wouldn't go into the house with her. He would take the boys and have a play day with them while Sian had Sunday lunch with her family. After 2 years of this, Sian was eventually diagnosed with motor neuron disease, and this occurred on Friday the 11th of December 2015. It was also confirmed that this was terminal, and her prognosis as the condition developed would not be very long at all. She wouldn't at the end be able to look after herself or her boys, so Arthur would need to step up and take a more responsible role, but then Sian was the breadwinner in the family, so she wasn't sure how this would work. So, of course, she turned to her family. Sian also didn't want to be with Arthur anymore, and her family were very keen for her to leave him because they knew how controlling he was. So the Sunday after her diagnosis, Arthur drove Sian to her mother's house in Walthamstow, and they had Sunday lunch together. And Sian had voiced her desire to come back and live with her mother because she didn't want to be with Arthur anymore. It wasn't just her physical health that was suffering as a result of this. Mentally and emotionally, she'd been beaten down, so she wasn't in a good way. She needed the love of her family around her, and they were absolutely willing to take her on. After this Sunday lunch, Arthur went to collect Sian from her house with the boys, and then they drove home. In many cases, the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they want to leave their partner, or even when they talk about leaving or give an impression that they want to leave or take steps to leave. This is another reason why victims of domestic violence don't leave, because they know that if they do, then the threat of violence, the threat of anything against their life ramps up. So they try and keep it down by staying. The perpetrator is very good at isolating the victim from friends and family to trap them, so leaving would not be an option, sometimes even locking them in the home, taking away any means of communication. In the evening of the 13th of December 2015, as per normal, Pansy waited for Sian to give her a call to confirm they got home safely, but Pansy didn't hear from Sian. This was alone very out of character. I can go days, weeks without speaking to my family and friends. They wouldn't necessarily think that there's anything wrong if they don't hear from me. But with Sian, she was in contact with her family almost every single day, and it was always agreed that she would let them know when she got home safely, but she didn't. By the next day, nobody had heard from Sian, nor had she responded to any texts or calls. This was not only out of character, but the family were very worried for her because of her physical health and also her relationship. She had a degenerative disease with 2 young boys. Sian's mother, sister, and aunt contacted the NSPCC and the police due to their concern over Sian and the welfare of the 2 boys. By the Tuesday, though, there was finally some contact from Sian. Her family and even her agent had received some texts from her phone. However, there was something not quite right about these texts. Whenever Sian sent her messages, she always used correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar. She always spelled things out correctly. She never used abbreviations or text speak. But these messages contained spelling errors, abbreviations, and they just were not in keeping with her usual construct of messages. The main thing, though, that people were concerned about was that these messages said that Sian wanted to take some time away from everything, so she would take the boys just to have some time on her own, and she wouldn't be contactable for some time. This was allegedly because of her diagnosis of motor neuron disease, but Sian could not take care of herself and her boys on her own without help. If she really needed some time away, she would go to her family. She wouldn't run away from her life and her family, she would go towards them. And she was even talking about moving back in with them. She wasn't talking about taking time away. So why this sudden change of approach to what was going on in her life? This led the family to think that these messages weren't written by Sian and weren't even dictated to her by somebody. They believed that these messages were being sent from her phone, but it was somebody else that was sending them, pretending to be Sian. Sian's family continued to contact the police and voice their concerns, and the police went to Sian's home in Pembroke Road, Erith, at 4 p.m. on the 16th of December 2015, a Wednesday. Nobody had heard from Sian in 3 days. Now, this doesn't sound excessive for some people, but for Sian it would be, especially someone who's ill and who has 2 young boys with a partner who is not stepping up and helping. The police knocked on the door and Arthur Simpson-Kent answered, and he said that his partner and children were okay and were in Cambridge. He echoed what the text messages said, that Sian wanted some time away, she'd taken the boys, and was just going to be on her own with them for a little while. Whilst anyone over the age of 18 in the UK is free to go wherever they please, Sian was vulnerable and she had 2 young children, but the police were satisfied with what Arthur Simpson-Kent explained and they left the property. They did go back a few days later just to see if Sian had returned, but when the police arrived, the property was empty. Arthur was gone and the neighbours reported that they'd seen him load up his car and drive away a couple of days prior. This was leading up to Christmas and Sian's family were extremely concerned, and the police had not done anything further than the 2 calls to the house. She had 2 young boys with her, and even if she needed some time away, she would go to her family, especially at a time at Christmas. She'd arranged with her family that she would spend a few hours on Christmas Day with them. Ava, Sian's sister, said they didn't even have Arthur's number. That's how distant he was from them, so they couldn't even check in with him. Over Christmas, the family eagerly awaited contact from Sian. They were hoping that the information they'd been given from Arthur in these text messages were correct. Sian had agreed to spend Christmas with her family, albeit just a few hours. Now, this was another example of how controlling Arthur was. Sian wanted to spend more than a few hours with her family, but he wouldn't allow her to. At Christmas, they were hoping against all hope that Arthur was telling the truth, even if he had sent those messages. If he'd sent them on behalf of Sian if she physically couldn't type them, but there was no contact made by Sian, and Sian did not turn up at her mother's house. The family went to the police again, and it wasn't until New Year's Day in 2016 that the disappearance of Sian, Zachary and Amon were actually taken seriously. More than 2 weeks after they were last seen and reported missing by the police, the police had not taken any steps to make appeals to the public until then, despite Sian being vulnerable, being in a weakened state with 2 young children and a partner that was not helping her, and apparently she'd gone off on her own. They should have done something much sooner than just making 2 visits to the home and going, okay, fine. After this 2-week period, it made front page news. A former Eastenders actress and her sons have gone missing and she's vulnerable. The Metropolitan Police has been heavily criticised with how they handled the initial stages of this missing person investigation. After the Met Police finally took this seriously, their searchers led them to Bethnal Green, where they found Sian's car abandoned. Nobody was in it, nobody had been back to it for some time, neither Sian, the boys, nor Arthur Simpson-Kent. It was this development, despite the fact that no bodies had been found, her family had heard nothing, there'd been no reported sightings, nothing. This caused the case to be deferred to a specialist homicide department to investigate as a potential murder. Sian's home in Pembroke Road, Erith, was searched, and on the 5th of January 2016, the police found what they hoped not to find. The deceased bodies of Sian, 43, Zachary, 8, and Amon, 4. They had been buried in the back garden of the property under some flagstones, and their murderer had made attempts to ensure the ground did not look like it had been disturbed. Blood was found all over the home when luminol was used. This was invisible to the naked eye because the walls had been painted over. Post-mortems revealed that Sian, Zachary and Amon had been murdered with an unknown blunt object that had caused trauma to their heads and to their necks. The pathologist commented that the injuries showed that the deaths would have been, quote, mercifully quick. Given that Sian was weak, she would not have been able to defend herself nor her boys. It wasn't clear as to what order this took place or what the scene actually looked like. It's likely that the boys watched their mother die, one or the other watched the other one die, or Sian watched her boys being murdered. It's just so horrific to imagine the terror knowing that you're going to be beaten to death or are being beaten to death and there's nothing you can do about it, and your children either are being beaten or will be. The boys would not have been able to do anything either to fight off their attacker. They were only 8 and 4. Given Sian's lack of contact with her family after she departed from her mother's on the 13th of December 2015, it was deduced that she'd been killed or subdued that very evening or within 48 hours. There was only one suspect: Arthur Simpson-Kent. His movements after the time that Sian fell silent were reviewed, and it was found he had fled to his native Ghana on the 19th of December 2015. The fact that he'd killed the family, dug the graves, covered them over, painted the whole house in just a few days does indicate that this may have been premeditated and not simply a crime of passion done on the spur of the moment. Therefore, the appeals put out by the police and the media switched from a missing person inquiry to murder inquiry. An appeal was put directly to Arthur Simpson-Kent to come forward or someone to provide leads as to his whereabouts. The news was broadcast all over the world, and someone in Ghana had indeed seen him, said they seen him in a nightclub. Arthur's family lived in Ghana, and it seemed that he'd actually gone back to them, so the Met Police sent a squad to Ghana to track down Arthur Simpson-Kent. By the time the bodies had been found, he'd been in Ghana for some time. The risk was that Arthur Simpson-Kent could flee Ghana. He may already have done so. He may not be found because, as Mike Sullivan of The Sun said, it's very easy to disappear in Africa because there's a lot of remote places you can go and you may never be found. This may have been Arthur Simpson-Kent's goal, ultimately, to disappear in Africa, so there was a serious urgency to try and find him. In Ghana, he had actually been seen in a nightclub, so he had absolutely no conscience and no qualms at all what he'd done back in the UK and that he'd obliterated his family. Thanks to the extensive coverage of what happened and the appeals for Arthur Simpson-Kent, the Ghanaian press and the public were very instrumental in tracking him down. The Ghanaian police and also the Ghanaian public, they helped the Met Police as much as they could, actively searching for him. Arthur Simpson-Kent was eventually tracked down in his hometown, literally under a rock, as it was put in one documentary, literally under a rock, on the 9th of January 2016 near the beach. He'd gone into a small cave-like cavity in a rock, but was nonetheless located and surrendered to the Ghanaian police and was held on remand. Processes began to extradite Arthur from Ghana to the UK, and during the time that this was going ahead, Arthur and his legal team argued that he shouldn't be on remand because he hadn't been convicted of anything, and holding him was violating his human rights. However, he was still held and actually voluntarily returned to the UK, so that meant that the extradition process was not necessary. This really helped to expedite the case to get him to the UK, get him arrested and charged. On the 12th of February 2016, after being on remand for over a month, he flew back and was arrested at Heathrow Airport. Arthur's trial commenced on the 10th of June 2016 and he pleaded guilty to the murders of Sian Blake and their sons, Zachary and Amon. Yet he did try and get out of this. He said that what he did to his family was due to an agreement he had with Sian. Apparently, she had asked him to kill her and the children due to her debilitating illness. She said she knew that she wouldn't be able to care for them anymore and didn't want her kids to be without their mother, so had asked Arthur to kill her and them. This defense was rejected because of the steps that Arthur Simpson-Kent had taken to cover up his crime and to evade capture and justice, and also he murdered them in a very brutal way. If there was some sort of pact, wouldn't you do it the most least painful way possible? Also, Sian's family were willing to look after her children after she passed away. They said they would raise them in a loving home. Mr. Justice Singh sentenced Arthur Simpson-Kent to the harshest punishment he could have, which is a whole life tariff. So he will never be free. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. This is a very rare sentence passed down, but the judge felt this was warranted given the brutality of the killings. It's more than likely that the reason why Arthur did this is because Sian was going to leave him, and he knew that. Family annihilators often do this to either stop a family from leaving them or to save face, not having to pay child support, to be free of their family sometimes, and they just want to restart their life. Either way, Arthur Simpson-Kent has never explained why. The family would like to know why, because he's never said to them why he did this, nor exactly how the murders happened. He wanted to control Sian. He wanted to keep her under lock and key, and now for the rest of his life, he is going to be under lock and key. Yet this doesn't bring back a wonderful woman who worked hard for her life passion, acting and signing, and it doesn't bring back those two little boys who had so much ahead of them and were loved by their family. 3 lives were lost due to a coward and a monster who will thankfully never walk free again. Gemma Rose Veronica McCluskie was born on the 5th of February 1983 in the East End of London and was the third of 3 children to Anthony and Pauline McCluskie. She had 2 older brothers, Anthony Jr., known as Tony, and Danny. Gemma was loud, bold, and not afraid to speak her mind, but was extremely kind and a very bubbly person who had a large circle of friends with whom she was very, very tight and was a social butterfly. She was also very close to her family. Gemma's passion in life was acting. She attended stage school, after which at the age of 17 she got a role in Eastenders, playing the role of Kerry Skinner from October 2000 to February 2001. Kerry Skinner was written out as a character from Eastenders. Although a main, even if short-lived, role on a soap like Eastenders would seem like a big break and a gateway to more roles, Gemma struggled to find work as an actress after this, but she still worked very, very hard and worked numerous shifts in bars and clubs to support herself, and eventually became a full-time carer for her mother Pauline, who by 2012 was terminally ill with cancer. Gemma, her mother, and her oldest brother Tony shared a maisonette in East London, and in February 2012, Pauline McCluskie had been admitted to hospital. Gemma continued to work at her pub, look after the flat. Everything continued as normal as much as it could. On the 1st of March 2012, Gemma attended the opening ceremony of the Royal London Hospital. She filmed the ceremony on her phone for a friend whose daughter was performing in the ceremony. This took place in the morning, and in the early afternoon, Gemma went to a friend's house, during which Gemma received a call on her phone, and her friends heard her having a loud and angry argument with a male at the other end of the phone. It was clear that Gemma was having a huge issue with them, and nasty words were exchanged. Gemma apologized to her friends and said she had to go home, so she left the house and returned to her maisonette. The next day, Gemma was due to work a shift at the club in Kingsland Road, but didn't turn up for her shift. Nor had any of her friends heard from her. Gemma was a very social and friendly person who never went a day without speaking to her friends. So this was very strange. Nobody received a text back from Gemma, nor did she answer her phone for a few days. Her brother Tony, with whom she lived, called their father Anthony and said he hadn't heard from Gemma, nor had her workplace. Gemma's other brother Danny had been asking around as he hadn't been able to get hold of Gemma. She hadn't been at home, she hadn't been at work, not with any of her friends or her family, nor her ex, with whom she was still very close. Days went by without word, so Tony and Danny went with a friend of Gemma's to Bethnal Green police station to report their sister as missing. While at the police station, they gave reports on their last known movements of Gemma. Tony lived with Gemma, so he was the one that was closest to her in terms of vicinity and physicality. But Tony gave 3 different versions of his last interaction with Gemma. Danny got very annoyed with his older brother, believing his cloudy memory was caused by Tony's use of a very strong strain of cannabis called skunk. Cannabis contains a chemical called THC, which is normally between 2 and 4% in normal cannabis. But skunk is a highly concentrated, strong form of cannabis, and the THC level is much higher. One expert said that a way to think of this if you compare cannabis to alcohol is that normal cannabis is like lager, and skunk is more like vodka. Tony's memory may have been foggy because he smoked huge amounts of skunk a day, between 50 and 20 joints at some points, and he'd been doing that in the flat he shared with Gemma and their mother. This was not something that Gemma wanted him to do, not smoking in the house or even at all, because it changed Tony's personality, and he tended to have a quick temper anyway before that, but smoking the skunk just exacerbated that. His forgetfulness due to drug use was evident, as his actions at home showed this, such as the day that Gemma was last seen, the morning before she went to the hospital. Tony started to run a bath, but fell asleep. The bath overflowed and leaked down into the hallway. The flat that they shared was in a block, but it was over 2 floors, and they lived on the ground floor, so this water damage wouldn't have done any damage to neighbours' property, but it was still a serious incident at home. However, surely that wouldn't account for Gemma suddenly going missing. As someone who was very much loved and cherished, or who knew her, Gemma's well-being was very much their main focus. Danny McCluskie was very prominent in this. He was very anxious to find their sister. He was very upset and emotional. He was panicked. He was frantically searching for Gemma physically and via social media and phone. Tony, by contrast, was calm, level-headed and collected, assuring everyone Gemma will be okay, and he barely left the flat, saying that whilst everyone was out looking for Gemma, he wanted to be at the flat in case she returned. Gemma's disappearance was eventually covered in the media. Even the reporters who spoke with the brothers noticed a huge difference in Danny and Tony's attitudes. Danny was beside himself with worry and distress. Tony, just like he'd been with everyone else, was very calm, emotionless, not as concerned as one would expect. On the 5th of March 2012, Gemma's friends and some family members did a mass search through Bethnal Green, handing out flyers and asking anyone if they'd seen Gemma. However, Tony once again said that he would stay at home in case Gemma came back or she called. This was until Tony found out the search party was being covered by the media, and it was only then that he decided to join in the search. The next day at Acton's Lock in Regent's Canal, a lady noticed that her barge had hit an object which seemed rather large and out of place. She investigated it and saw a large suitcase bobbing in the water. The suitcase opened, and out floated a headless, armless and legless human torso. The police were contacted, and because a local woman had gone missing, they rushed to tell Anthony McCluskie as soon as possible before he heard it via the media. They told Mr. McCluskie that there had indeed been a body found in the canal and was undergoing formal identification. What the police did not tell Gemma's father was that they'd already seen the torso had a bow tattoo on the small of the back, which is a tattoo that Gemma had. They were sure that this was Gemma's torso, but until DNA testing had been done, her DNA had been lifted from her toothbrush, they didn't share this with Mr. McCluskie nor the press. The DNA taken from the torso was compared to the DNA on the toothbrush, and it was confirmed that the torso was that of Gemma McCluskie. She had been dismembered, wrapped in plastic, and left in the canal to resurface. More body parts were found over the next few days, her arms and her legs, but no head. Anthony McCluskie was adamant that there would be no burial, no funeral, no cremation, nothing, until all of his daughter was found. The funeral home assured Mr. McCluskie that they would keep his daughter safe until she was complete again. The body parts recovered were proof that she had been dismembered, but they didn't yield any information as to her cause of death, nor whether or not this was indeed a murder, whether it was an accident or natural causes and someone had dismembered her out of just panicking. Because these body parts didn't show a cause of death, it's likely that her head would yield that information. What was also puzzling was who could have done this to Gemma. When she was loved by so many people, she didn't have any enemies to anyone's knowledge. A forensic psychologist reviewed the case, and their analysis was that given the fact that Gemma had been dismembered, it's more than likely that she was dismembered and killed in the same place. And this is usually on the premises of either the murderer or the victim, or one shared by both. Dismemberment is also deeply personal, and it's rarely done by a perpetrator and a victim who don't know each other. Gemma's personal life was probed deeper, and there was one common issue that kept arising: her brother, Tony McCluskie. Tony and Gemma had a relationship that had never been close, actually the complete opposite. They had been at loggerheads for years, ever since they were little, and sometimes becoming physical. When they were younger, Tony would actually attack Gemma sometimes. She was under 5 feet tall, she was tiny, she was not a violent type either, so even with a huge personality like she had, she was not a physical match for her brother, who would have been bigger and stronger than she was. Tony and Gemma's lives were also very different. Gemma had success as an actress, was popular, she worked hard in a pub and was responsible. Tony job hopped, had little success socially, and was very irresponsible. He didn't take good care of himself physically and smoked skunk heavily. Even before his drug habit, Tony was a volatile man, having attacked his baby sister on several occasions in both childhood and in adulthood. THC makes someone paranoid, and taken to the quantities that Tony was using it, can make someone develop symptoms very similar to paranoid schizophrenia. Memory problems were common, such as the bath incident. One of Gemma's close friends reported that Gemma would turn up at her house without any belongings with her, following a row with Tony in which it had become so tumultuous that Gemma had left the house in a hurry because she was actually very scared of him. Anthony McCluskie said that Tony, in the time building up to Gemma's disappearance, had, quote, let himself go and spent the whole night, quote, smashed out of his skull. Tony had been open about this incident and said that Gemma was furious and had told Tony that this was the last straw. Their mother was terminally ill in hospital. He'd been abusing cannabis so much she wanted him out. At the party where Gemma had received a phone call and had heated exchange words with an unknown male to the friends at the time, it turned out that this was Tony. He was being very nasty and aggressive with her, and she was saying to him she wanted him out. She was absolutely sick of his behaviour. At 10 to 2 in the afternoon of the 1st of March 2012, Gemma's car was picked up on CCTV driving back to her flat in Pelter Street. Not long after, there was no more activity on her phone. It wasn't even pinging. Police believe that her phone was switched off shortly after she arrived home. She wasn't seen leaving the home on foot, nor in a car, nor any other means. Who was at home with her? Tony McCluskie. Tony McCluskie was arrested and interviewed under caution, during which he answered no comment to any questions regarding the murder of his own sister. This was very different to how he was when he initially spoke with the police, when he gave a lot of information and was speaking freely. If he didn't kill Gemma, if he had nothing to do with her disappearance, wouldn't he be willing to do everything he could to help try and find her? Tony's whereabouts on and around the 1st of March 2012 and his phone records were investigated. On the day Gemma was thought to have been killed, Tony made no contact with his girlfriend, but sent an apologetic text the night after to apologise for not contacting her the day before. He visited his mother on the morning of the 2nd of March 2012 and texted Gemma at 5 p.m. that day saying, quote, "Gem, ring me when you get this message. What are you having for dinner? Are you working tonight? Kiss kiss." It was either with this message or another message that Tony sent her a text saying, "Love you, kiss kiss." When the police check phone records, they don't just check what happened on or around a date of an incident. They go back and look at consistencies and habitual use of certain language in messages and common denominators in the form of forensic linguistics. None of the previous messages that Tony sent his sister ever had the words "love you" and never had kisses. This was a huge outlier. So why had he done this? Was it a way of covering his tracks? Or was this a sarcastic, posthumous parting word to her, one that she couldn't respond to? Tony then called a taxi company, which was only down the road from where he lived, and when these records were checked, it was found that Tony had used a false name, which was also suspicious. The police spoke with the cab firm and said that this man, who gave his name as Tom, had a very large and heavy suitcase that he had taken to the cab office down the road, was then helped by the cab driver to get it into the boot of the car. The CCTV of the area behind the cab firm showed a man struggling with a heavy suitcase, which was put into the boot of the cab. A forensic search of this cab showed faint traces of blood, which were matched to Gemma McCluskie. The cabbie took Tom to Acton Lock at Regent's Canal. He was seen dragging a suitcase along the canal by a student and was captured on nearby CCTV. Anthony McCluskie was shown footage of the man dragging the suitcase to the cab. Anthony confirmed that the man in that footage was indeed his son, Tony. Mr. McCluskie asked his son outright what happened. Tony said that Gemma came home and flew into a violent rage, brandishing a knife and screaming at him. But Mr. McCluskie didn't believe that this would happen. That was not like Gemma at all. When carrying out forensic testing on the flat, it was surprisingly not yielding the typical evidence that one would expect after a brutal murder and dismemberment. There would normally be vast quantities of blood, even if cleaned off, because luminol can pick up where blood has been, even if it had been cleaned. But the flat didn't show this, even to the point that some investigators doubted the murder and dismemberment actually took place there. There were 2 small spots of blood in the bathroom and the kitchen, but these could easily have been from when somebody cuts themselves at home. So this was not proof that the death occurred there. This was until forensic checks found something else in the kitchen. Not blood, but a fragment of a piece of an internal organ. This was from a part of Gemma that could only be on the outside if extracted and not by normal domestic means. More CCTV showed on the morning after Gemma's death, either before or after Tony had visited his mother, that he went to a shop to buy cleaning supplies and bin liners. He also bought newspaper and cigarettes, which Anthony McCluskie found shocking, as his son was just going about life without a care in the world. Gemma's head, though, at this point of the investigation still hadn't been found. Mr. McCluskie said that he had nothing but praise for the people that were assisting the police with the searches, but her head still hadn't been located, so cause of death couldn't be determined. It wasn't until 6 months after Gemma went missing that her head was finally found, and was found in a bag 2 miles down the Regent's Canal. Just as what was anticipated, her head was what was needed to determine the cause of death: blunt force trauma. She'd been hit on the head with a heavy, blunt object and had died from a hematoma, or a brain bleed. The identification of the item that was used to strike Gemma has never been found, but it was likely something like a heavy glass ashtray. The analysis of the method of dismemberment confirmed that her murderer had evolved in their confidence and ability further along the dismemberment. It would have taken hours to do, and quite a lot of that time was actually dismembering the first few limbs. Given the way the cuts were done, it was shown that Tony had gained experience and confidence the more he dismembered his sister's body using various knives. He was able to use less cuts. It was much easier for him, the longer ahead it went. The hit to the head could have been a crime of passion or enrage, but Gemma had been cut into pieces and dumped. After determining her cause of death, Gemma was now complete, so her funeral took place, which was on the 30th of November in 2012. Tony's trial began on the 14th of January 2013 at the Old Bailey. Tony's defense was that he did not remember the incident nor subsequently covering it up. Where have we heard all that before? Many cases, like Jodi Arias for example, conveniently losing their memory. He said he remembered punching her and then nothing. This was not accepted by the court because he bought items to cover his tracks, including things for himself. He butchered her, he got rid of her in the suitcase, he used a false name when calling the cab company, he sent text messages to her that were out of character, he then tried to help look for her. He knew she would not arrive home safe, he knew that she would not be out there. That's why he didn't search. Tony only went out when the press was there. Many, including Mr. McCluskie, believe that Tony was jealous of his sister, her success as an actress, her popularity, and how she had come far in life. He tried to control her like someone would try to control their spouse. As he couldn't control her nor the situation, this act seemed like the ultimate act of control. Tony's claim of amnesia was rejected by the court, and he was found guilty of the murder of Gemma McCluskie on the 30th of January 2013 and was sentenced to life with a maximum term of 20 years. Some believe this to have been premeditated because of how calm and collected he was and how methodical he was about how he dealt with the situation afterwards. Some say it was out of anger and he struck her after having an altercation, panicked and decided that rather than call for help, he would just get rid of her. Potentially, if he got aid to her, Gemma could have been saved. Or even if she couldn't have been saved, he could have contacted someone or emergency services, and Mr. McCluskie said to his son, "Why didn't you contact me? I'd have come right over." Anthony McCluskie has suffered greatly. He said Gemma was the love of his life. He's lost his youngest and only daughter. He didn't want to lose his son, so he stood by Tony, much to the confusion of many, including the other members of the family. Anthony McCluskie begged and implored his son after the conviction to say what happened for his own peace of mind, but Tony refused to say and continued to claim amnesia, not taking responsibility, not showing any remorse, and repeating himself again and again in many of the letters that he and his father exchanged. And he never mentioned Gemma's name in these letters. This is typical of distancing. Eventually, Mr. McCluskie had enough. He had spent years trying to get the answers from his son, but all of the letters were just repeating the same thing. So he's cut off contact with Tony. He didn't want to lose his son as well as Gemma, and Tony had the opportunity to keep the relationship with his father going, but he didn't take it. Now this is likely because Tony holding on to one part of Gemma that he has within his grasp is him having ultimate control of her still even in death. He couldn't live up to the higher standards that Gemma had set and achieved for herself, so he felt inferior to her and was jealous of her, so he could get one up on her by keeping the last secrets of the last moments of her life to himself forever. It's him besting her. He will never give it up because it will mean losing control and becoming vulnerable like he was before Gemma was murdered. Murdering Gemma gave him a feeling of being above his sister for the first time, and I doubt he will ever admit the truth because that means he'll go back to being the Tony before. I have the utmost sympathy and respect for Mr. McCluskie and his son Danny. Pauline McCluskie, Gemma, Tony and Danny's mother, passed away a year after Gemma was killed from a brain tumour. I would like to add finally, please be mindful of the families of the victims with your comments because they may see these. They will be forever scarred by what has happened to them. Please remember the victims and understand that they lived, they breathed. Unfortunately, they're no longer here, but we will never forget them. Thank you very much for watching this video, little berries, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.